The whole town in Duluth laughed when he started digging those 47 holes in frozen ground, and now they wished they'd helped. An old veteran in a thick red and black buffalo-plaid flannel jacket built a second wall around his little cabin, just trying to survive one more winter with his loyal German shepherd. But then the blizzard hit like a door slamming shut, and the howls came organized, too organized. When his dog started growling at one exact spot along the inner perimeter, the veteran found fresh claw scrapes in the snow, like someone had been taking notes. What happened next turned one stubborn man's crazy project into the only reason anyone lived to see spring. Before we jump in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments, because these winter stories have a way of traveling farther than the wind. Winter pressed down on Duluth with iron weight, snow drifting sideways under a wind that smelled of frozen Pine Lake ice, and a season that had not yet shown its teeth, but already promised pain. 3 nights before the wall would save his life. Frank Walker woke to a sound that pulled him from sleep, the way artillery once had, quiet, deliberate, impossible to ignore. It wasn't knocking. It wasn't random scraping. It was slow, patient scratching claws, testing wood grain by grain learning. Frank lay still on his narrow bed, breath shallow, heart steady in that way only men who had survived worse things could manage. At 64, his body was stiff with old injuries, his shoulders broad but stooped, his face cut with deep lines, earned from decades of wind, sun, and war. A gray beard framed a mouth that rarely smiled, and his eyes, sharp, pale, permanently watchful, tracked the darkness even as he pretended to sleep. He wore his habits like armor, including the thick red and black buffalo-plaid flannel jacket folded neatly on the chair beside the bed, ready for emergencies. Beside him, Rex lifted his head. The German shepherd was 9 years old, past his prime, but still powerful, with a silver sable coat dusted darker along the spine and amber eyes that reflected the faint firelight like polished stone. Rex did not bark. That alone told Frank everything. The dog's ears stood rigid, his chest vibrating with a low, restrained growl that spoke of calculation, not fear. Frank reached out, resting 2 fingers against the dog's shoulder, feeling the tension there, the same tension he remembered in young soldiers waiting for contact. Outside, the scratching paused, resumed, then multiplied. Frank counted patterns, not sounds, long drags, short taps, circling motions. By the time silence returned, he had counted 7. Morning revealed what the night had promised. The oak door bore deep grooves, clean and methodical, as if someone had drawn lines with purpose. Not wild panic, not hunger alone. Investigation. Frank crouched to study them, the cold biting through his jeans, Rex standing guard behind him. His breath fogged the air as memory rose uninvited perimeter checks in foreign deserts, fingers tracing disturbed sand. The knowledge that someone had been there first and might return better prepared. He had left the war years ago, but the war had not left him. It lived in reflexes, in the way his mind assembled threats into shapes and intentions. Frank Walker had come to Duluth after the funeral, after the last letter from the VA, after realizing that cities made him tired in ways forests never did. He was not a friendly man, but he was not cruel either. He nodded to neighbors, helped fix fences when asked, spoke little at the trading post. People described him as stubborn, quiet, a man who carried himself like he expected trouble even on clear days. They were not wrong. War had taught him that confidence was not optimism, it was preparation. Later that day, he walked into town for supplies, Rex trotting close at his side. The trading post smelled of coffee, damp wool, and old wood. Tom Harris leaned against the counter, a thick-necked man with a booming laugh, and hands made for splitting logs, not thinking past tomorrow. Tom had never liked Frank much. Quiet men unsettled him. "Heard something sniffing around your cabin last night," Tom said with a grin, not bothering to lower his voice. "Probably wolves. They don't bother people. You'll be fine." Laughter followed, easy and careless. Frank studied Tom's face, ruddy cheeks, confident eyes, a man who had lived his whole life believing yesterday predicted tomorrow. Frank nodded once, paid for his nails rope and extra gloves, and left without argument. Arguing had never saved anyone. The first hole took nearly an hour. The ground was already fighting him, frozen hard beneath a thin skin of snow. Each swing of the pick sent pain up his arms, old shrapnel scars burning like fresh wounds. Rex lay nearby, eyes fixed on the tree line, occasionally rising to pace the perimeter before settling again. Frank worked until his gloves soaked through with blood, then measured, adjusted, and dug again. He had decided on a circle the moment he saw the claw marks. Corners failed. Corners collected stress, snow pressure. A circle distributed force. He had learned that from field manuals and from watching rivers move around stones. On the third day, Eleanor Briggs stopped by. She was small, bent with age, wrapped in layers of faded coats, her white hair braided down her back, like something from another century. Her eyes, though, were sharp and unsettlingly calm. Eleanor had buried 2 husbands, survived a house fire, and outlived most of the men who had ever told her she worried too much. She watched Frank dig for a long time before speaking. "Animals are acting wrong," she said quietly. "Been wrong since early fall." Frank wiped his brow and met her gaze. "They're learning," he said. Eleanor nodded once, satisfied, as if he had confirmed something she already knew. By the end of the week, stakes marked a wide ring around the cabin, a promise scratched into frozen earth. Neighbors walked by, shaking heads, offering jokes about castles and paranoia. Frank let them. At night he sat by the fire, Rex's head on his boot, listening to the wind worry the walls, thinking about the wolves, and the way they had tested, withdrawn, remembered. He dreamed of watchtowers and endless snowfields of alarms that never rang in time. He woke before dawn each morning with the same certainty pressing on his chest. This winter was not ordinary. The animals confirmed it. Deer trails vanished. Rabbits stopped appearing near the brush. Birds flew low and fast, never lingering. Even Rex moved differently, resting less, scanning more. Frank trusted that more than any forecast. On the 10th night, the scratching returned, brief, distant, almost polite. Frank stood at the door in his flannel jacket, hand resting against the wood, feeling vibrations through his palm. Outside, something moved, then stopped, then moved on. Reconnaissance complete. He did not sleep after that. He sat at the table, sharpening tools, planning dimensions, calculating time. He knew he was already behind. But readiness, he reminded himself, was not about speed. It was about commitment. When the storm finally came, and he knew it would, he intended to be standing behind more than 4 walls and hope. He intended to be ready. Frank Walker began the wall the morning after the second night of scratching, when the silence felt heavier than noise, and the forest seemed to be holding its breath. Snow fell lightly, not enough to cover tracks, just enough to blur them, and the sky hung low over Duluth, like a lid pressed down by an unseen hand. Frank stood in the clearing, wearing his thick red and black buffalo-plaid flannel jacket, the fabric stiff with frost, the collar brushing against his gray beard as he measured distances with a length of rope. His movements were slow but precise, shaped by years of discipline rather than youth. Rex stayed close, circling the marked perimeter with deliberate steps, nose low, tail steady, stopping now and then to stare into the trees as if counting something only he could see. Frank did not explain himself to the air or to the neighbors who paused at a distance to watch. He explained himself only to the ground. The idea of a second wall had not come from fear of wolves alone. It came from memory. In the service, he had learned that the first barrier always failed. It failed because people trusted it too much. Layered defenses were not about stopping an enemy outright. They were about stealing time, forcing hesitation, creating moments to think and act. War had burned that lesson into him the day an outer checkpoint collapsed, and only a secondary barricade gave his unit enough minutes to survive. He still remembered the sound of metal screaming, the smell of smoke, and the weight of responsibility when younger men looked to him for decisions. Those men were gone now, but the lesson remained carved deeper than scars. By midday, the first holes were open, dark mouths in the frozen soil. Frank's hands shook slightly when he stopped to rest, not from cold, but from the old nerve damage in his left arm, a souvenir from an explosion decades earlier. He flexed his fingers until the feeling returned, then kept digging. Pain was familiar. Pain was predictable. What frightened him was unpredictability. Rex watched him work with quiet intensity, ears flicking at every distant crack of wood or shifting snow. At 9 years old, the dog carried himself with the dignity of experience, his muzzle graying his body, still powerful but economical, conserving energy the way Frank did. They understood each other without language. The laughter came in waves over the next few days. Men walking back from town slowed to comment. Some shook their heads. Some smiled with the indulgence reserved for harmless eccentrics. Tom Harris was the loudest. He stopped one afternoon, boots planted wide, hands hooked into his belt, his beard thick and reddish, his face weathered by a lifetime of believing winter was something you endured, not planned for. "You already got walls, Frank," he called out. "4 of them. Called a cabin." His voice carried easily across the snow. A couple of others chuckled from the road. "Wolves don't knock," Tom added. "They're scared of fire, scared of people. Always have been." Frank drove his shovel into the earth and leaned on it, breathing hard. He looked at Tom for a long moment, taking in the man's confidence, the way it rested on routine rather than observation. "Things change," Frank said finally, his voice low and even. Tom laughed again, louder this time, as if inviting the world to agree with him, then moved on. Frank returned to his measurements. He had learned long ago that arguing with certainty was like arguing with weather. It wasted strength you would need later. On the 4th day, Eleanor Briggs returned. She stood just outside the ring of stakes, small and wrapped in layers of old coats, her posture bent, but her eyes sharp. Eleanor had skin like worn leather, and hands knotted with age, but there was a steadiness to her that made younger people instinctively lower their voices around her. She had lived in Duluth since before the roads were paved, had watched winters come earlier and stay longer, had seen animals behave strangely before bad years. "You're building it wide," she observed, studying the spacing. Frank nodded. "Wide buys time," he said. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. "My grandmother used to say the same thing," she replied, not explaining further. She did not laugh. That mattered more to Frank than approval. As the holes multiplied, so did the signs. The usual rabbit tracks near the creek disappeared. A stand of birch, where deer often sheltered, remained untouched, the snow smooth and unbroken. Rex refused to sleep through the night now, waking at the slightest sound, pacing the cabin, until Frank rose to join him by the window. Frank felt a tightness in his chest he hadn't felt since his last deployment, a sense that the world was tilting towards something sharp. He reminded himself to eat, to drink water, to rest when his body demanded it. Preparation, he knew, was not just about structures. It was about endurance. Late one afternoon, another neighbor stopped by a man Frank had only nodded to in passing before. His name was Daniel Reed, a former schoolteacher who had moved north after his wife died. Reed was tall and thin, with a narrow face, wire-rimmed glasses, and hands that bore more ink stains than calluses. He stood watching Frank work, not smiling, not mocking, just observing. "Why a circle?" Reed asked eventually, his voice thoughtful rather than challenging. Frank straightened slowly, joints protesting, and gestured with his shovel. "No corners," he said. "Corners break first." Reed frowned, considering that. "From wind?" he asked. "From anything that pushes," Frank replied. Reed nodded as if filing the idea away. He stayed another hour asking questions, offering to help carry lumber when the time came. Frank did not say yes or no. He appreciated curiosity more than help. By the end of the second week, 47 holes ringed the cabin in a near-perfect circle. Frank stood in the center one evening, Rex beside him, and imagined the posts rising. The boards fitted the space between wall and cabin, filling with snow and supplies. He imagined wind breaking against uneven heights, snow drifting where he wanted it to, not where it chose. The vision steadied him. He did not know yet exactly what he was preparing for. He only knew that the land, the animals, and his own instincts were aligned in warning. That night, as Frank cleaned his tools by the fire, Rex suddenly stiffened, ears snapping forward. Frank followed his gaze to the door. There was no scratching this time. No sound at all. Just the sense of presence beyond the wood, of something waiting and watching. Frank rested his palm against the door, feeling the cold seep through, and spoke softly, more to himself than to the darkness. "Not yet," he murmured, "but soon." Rex pressed closer, a silent vow of loyalty and vigilance. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the promise of a winter that would test every assumption the town had made about safety. Frank did not smile. He sharpened his axe, checked his measurements again, and rose before dawn to continue digging. The wall was being laughed at, but it was already becoming something else. It was becoming a decision made permanent. The posts rose one by one, pale pine columns driven deep into the frozen ground, forming a circle so precise it looked unnatural against the ragged tree line, as if geometry itself had decided to settle in the wilderness outside Duluth. Frank Walker worked from dawn until the light failed his breath, steaming his shoulders, burning with a familiar grinding pain that reminded him of forced marches long ago. He welcomed the pain. Pain meant progress. Each post sank 3 feet into earth that fought him like stone and rose 8 feet into the air, their pale yellow wood stark against the encroaching snow. When Frank stepped back to look at them, the circle felt less like construction and more like declaration. This was no longer a cabin with a plan. This was the beginning of a fortress. Rex adapted to the new shape instinctively. The German shepherd began patrolling the inside of the ring every night, moving in a slow, deliberate circuit that mirrored Frank's own habits. At 9 years old, Rex no longer wasted motion. His silver sable coat blended with shadow and snow, his paws soundless on packed ground. He paused most often where the wind changed direction, where scent moved unpredictably, standing there longer, with ears angled forward, nose lifting and lowering, as if measuring the air. Frank noticed and adjusted his plans accordingly, marking those points mentally. He trusted Rex's instincts more than any calculation. The horizontal planks came next. Frank cut them himself, standing over the pit, saw muscles trembling as he pulled the blade downward again and again, splitting logs into boards with a rhythm that reminded him of old drills. He nailed them in uneven heights, 6 feet, here 8 feet, there 10 feet, in places where the wind struck hardest. Uniformity, he knew, invited pressure. Variation confused it. The wall's silhouette began to resemble broken teeth or castle battlements jagged against the gray sky. Neighbors walking past slowed now not to laugh, but to stare. No one commented on the change. The laughter had thinned, replaced by something quieter and heavier. Late one afternoon, Daniel Reed returned, his thin frame bundled in a long coat that hung awkwardly from his shoulders, his glasses fogging as he spoke. He watched Frank hammer planks into place, each strike precise despite the stiffness in Frank's left arm. "You're building it uneven on purpose," Reed said, more statement than question. Frank nodded without stopping. Reed frowned, thinking, then smiled faintly. "Wind won't know where to settle," he murmured, impressed. Reed's curiosity was different from mockery. It came from humility, from a man who had spent his life teaching children that the world was larger than their assumptions. He offered help again, quietly this time, and Frank accepted when it came to lifting boards. They worked without much talk, the kind of cooperation that did not require explanation. As the wall grew, the forest emptied. Tracks vanished from familiar paths. The creek lay silent, its banks undisturbed. One morning, Frank heard shouting from down the road. He followed the sound to Tom Harris's property, where feathers littered the snow like spilled ash. Tom stood over the remains of his chicken coop, his broad face pale beneath his beard. The wood had been pried apart, the wire bent inward. They dug, Tom said, voice low, shaken, went under. Frank knelt to examine the ground, noting the clean tunnel, the way it angled to avoid frozen roots. Purposeful. Learning. Tom swallowed hard. "Never seen wolves do that," he admitted. Frank said nothing. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't arrive too late. That night the wind rose. Not a storm yet, but a warning. It pushed against the half-finished wall and broke apart, swirling, instead of striking cleanly. Snow drifted unevenly along the outer edge, leaving the interior strangely calmer. Frank watched from the cabin window, Rex beside him, and felt a tight, unfamiliar satisfaction. The design worked. The idea held. Still, satisfaction was dangerous. He reminded himself that a fortress unfinished was an invitation. Another figure appeared one morning as Frank hauled planks across the snow. Sarah Miller stood at the edge of the clearing, arms wrapped around herself, dark hair pulled back beneath a wool cap. She was in her early 30s, tall and lean, with pale skin that reddened quickly in the cold, and eyes that carried more exhaustion than her age explained. A widow, Frank knew, though he did not know the details. Her husband had died 2 winters earlier in an accident on the ice road. She lived with her young son farther down the ridge. "I heard you're building something." "Different," she said hesitantly. Frank studied her face, noting the tension in her jaw, the way her gaze flicked toward the trees. "Different keeps you alive," he replied. Sarah nodded, relief crossing her features. "If you need extra boards," she said, "I've got some left from my husband's shed." Frank accepted with a simple nod. She left looking lighter, as if having spoken the fear aloud had loosened its grip. By the time the weather forecast reached town, whispered from radio to radio, passed along in lowered voices, the wall was nearly complete. The predictions spoke of a system dropping south from Canada, of temperatures plummeting, of wind sustained rather than gusting. The words meant little to most people. Frank translated them into images, snow stacking against walls, roofs, failing paths, erased. He worked through the night, lantern light flickering against the planks, Rex never leaving his side. When the final gate swung into place, reinforced with double-thick boards and a heavy bar, Frank rested his forehead against the wood and closed his eyes. Exhaustion washed over him, deep and bone-heavy, but beneath it lay something steadier. Readiness. The first true blast of the storm arrived 2 days later. Snow fell sideways, driven by a wind that screamed like something alive. Frank stood in the courtyard watching the wall take the force meant for the cabin. Snow piled high outside the circle, while inside it accumulated slowly, unevenly manageable. Rex moved between wall and door, restless but controlled. From beyond the barrier came distant howls, not close enough yet to touch, but close enough to remind. Frank pulled his flannel jacket tighter, feeling the rough fabric against his neck, grounding him. The fortress was no longer an idea. It was a fact standing between him and whatever the winter had decided to send. The blizzard did not arrive the way storms were supposed to, with warnings written across the sky or a gradual tightening of the air. It arrived like a slammed door. One moment the world beyond Frank Walker's wall was gray and watchful. The next it was erased, swallowed by wind so violent it felt physical, as if something enormous had taken hold of Duluth and begun to shake it. Snow came sideways, then upward, then everywhere at once, filling the air until distance ceased to exist. Frank was in the courtyard when it struck his red and black buffalo-plaid flannel jacket already crusted with ice. Rex beside him, muscles coiled. The wind hit them both hard enough to stagger a younger man. Frank caught himself against the wall, fingers digging into the rough pine, feeling the structure hold. That was the first confirmation. The wall was doing its job. Within hours, the cabin itself disappeared from view. Its roof swallowed beneath drifting snow. Its windows darkened one by one as the drifts climbed. But inside the circular barrier, the air moved differently. The uneven heights broke the wind into confused currents, and snow piled erratically instead of relentlessly. Frank noticed this with a soldier's detached focus, even as his body began to feel the cold, in ways it had not since nights spent half-buried in foreign terrain. He rationed his movements, his breathing, his thoughts. Panic wasted heat. Panic wasted time. Rex paced the perimeter, then returned, then paced again, nails clicking softly on packed snow, his breath steady, his eyes bright and alert. The dog did not whine. He did not bark. He was working. The first night passed without intrusion, only the roar of the storm and the groaning of the wall as it absorbed the force meant to crush the cabin. Frank slept in short bursts, boots on tools laid out within reach. On the third night, the howls came. They cut through the wind with terrifying clarity, not the lonely calls Frank remembered from distant ridges, but layered voices answering and coordinating. Rex froze mid-step, ears snapping forward, his growl low and sustained. Frank climbed the inner ladder to one of the observation gaps, bracing himself against the wind that clawed at his jacket. Through the white chaos, he saw movement shadows circling, then eyes, dozens of them, reflecting what little light filtered through the storm. The wolves did not rush the wall. That would have been simple. They moved along its perimeter, noses to the snow, stopping and starting communicating in brief sounds and gestures Frank recognized with a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. This was reconnaissance. When they began to dig, they did so at a point where two sections of planking met where the ground beneath had frozen unevenly around roots. They worked in shifts, fresh animals replacing tired ones, snow and frozen dirt flying behind them. Frank counted again as he had that first night. More than 20. Far more than he had ever seen together. He moved without hesitation. The repair kit he had assembled waited by the cabin door, extra boards, nails, hammer, shovel lengths of wire. He ran along the inside of the wall boots, sinking into snow that had not yet hardened. Rex at his heels. The wolves heard him and redoubled their efforts. Frank nailed boards across the threatened section from the inside hands, shaking with cold and effort, every strike echoing through the night. Each plank bought minutes. Each minute mattered. He felt the old war memories rise, the claustrophobia of fighting an enemy you could not see clearly, the exhaustion that crept in when adrenaline burned away. By dawn, the wolves had tunneled several feet beneath the outer barrier, but they had not breached the courtyard. Frank spent the morning filling the tunnel with rocks and frozen debris, working until his arms felt like stone. Rex stood guard occasionally, snapping at movement beyond the wall, then resuming his watch. The wolves withdrew into the trees as daylight strengthened, but Frank knew better than to believe it was over. Sieges were not won in a night. They returned every evening after that. Sometimes they dug. Sometimes they tested different points along the wall, probing, learning his response time. On the fifth night, they attempted to climb using drifts that had built against the outer wall, to leap toward the uneven top. Frank extended sections upward with spare boards, fingers numb, mind razor-focused. On the seventh night, they attacked 3 points at once. Frank ran between them, breath tearing at his lungs, Rex racing ahead to alert him to the worst breaches. He slept in fragments of 2 hours, waking to scratching, to howls, to the sound of snow shifting ominously against the wood. On the 9th night, Frank ran out of nails. He stared at the empty box by lantern light, the weight of exhaustion pressing down until his thoughts slowed. Outside, the wolves had found a warped plank, a gap small but promising. He felt the edge of despair, then sharp and dangerous. He thought of Sarah Miller and her son, of Eleanor Briggs, alone in her house, of Tom Harris and his family, buried somewhere beneath the snow. He thought of younger men who had looked to him once, trusting him to find a way. He stood abruptly, heart pounding, and crossed to the storage area beneath the cabin floor. The traps were old rusted steel leg holds his father had used decades earlier, never thrown away because some part of Frank had always believed in keeping tools, even ones you hoped never to use. He had sworn after the war that he would never set another trap, never be the cause of suffering, if he could help it. But the storm had stripped away ideals, leaving only responsibility. He cleaned and set 12 traps by candlelight, fingers clumsy but determined, then placed them along the inside perimeter, at points the wolves had favored, burying them beneath thin layers of snow. The sounds that followed were terrible. Yelps of pain and rage cut through the night, followed by frantic movement as the pack attempted rescue. Frank watched from the wall, stomach clenched, as wolves worked together to dig around trapped members, to gnaw at chains, to coordinate efforts with an intelligence that unsettled him deeply. They did not abandon their own. By morning, 3 wolves lay dead, several more wounded. The pack withdrew again, smaller now, changed. The blizzard lasted 11 days. 11 days of wind that never truly stopped, of cold so deep it burned. Frank burned through his firewood faster than planned, rationed food, carefully monitored. Rex's pause for ice damage spoke aloud sometimes, just to keep his voice alive. On the 11th morning, he woke to silence so complete it rang in his ears. He stepped into the courtyard and saw blue sky for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. Snow lay 15 feet deep outside the wall, burying the landscape beyond recognition. Inside it stood lower, broken, survivable. The wolves were gone. Their tracks led north, away from town, a retreat beaten into the snow. Frank allowed himself one moment then. He leaned against the wall, closed his eyes, and let the tension drain away in a single shuddering breath. Rex pressed against his leg, solid and warm. The siege had ended. The wall had held. The silence after the blizzard felt wrong at first, too complete, as if the world had been drained of breath and left hollow. Frank Walker stood at the gate of his wall before sunrise. Snowshoes strapped tight, his red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket stiff with frost, Rex pressed against his leg, alert but calm. Beyond the circular barrier, the landscape no longer resembled Duluth as anyone remembered it. Snow lay in sculpted waves 15 feet deep. In places, roofs vanished, roads erased, fences reduced to suggestions beneath white. The wind had moved on, leaving behind a stillness that made every sound. His own breathing, the creak of leather, the soft crunch of Rex's paws feel too loud. Frank did not wait. He took a shovel, a rope, extra food, and moved toward the nearest neighbor he could remember, by instinct, alone, counting steps where the road should have been. The work was brutal. Snow packed hard in layers, each foot revealing another, the effort pulling at muscles already hollowed out by 11 days of siege. Rex ranged ahead and back, finding edges, sniffing for air pockets, stopping abruptly where someone might be beneath. Frank followed those stops with grim focus. At Tom Harris's place, he dug for hours before his shovel struck wood. Tom emerged barely conscious, beard rimed with ice, eyes bloodshot, his hands shaking uncontrollably. His wife and children followed, wrapped in blankets, alive by the narrowest margin. Tom could not meet Frank's eyes. He did not apologize. He did not need to. The laughter was gone. The rescues took days. Frank worked until his hands bled again, until his shoulders burned with a familiar grinding pain. Some homes yielded survivors who wept in relief, clinging to him as if he were an anchor in a shifting world. Others were empty. Frank forced himself to enter those cabins, to note the details with the same discipline he had once used to clear rooms in combat. Doors broken inward. Walls marked with deep, methodical scratches. No bodies. No bones. Just blood frozen dark against pale wood. Each time he stood for a moment longer than necessary, breathing slowly, Rex at his side, then turned away to keep moving. Mourning could wait. Survival could not. When the last reachable neighbor had been accounted for, people gathered at Frank's wall, drawn by the only open space large enough to hold them. The courtyard, once a calculated buffer, became something else entirely. Fires burned along the inner perimeter, food was shared without accounting, and voices rose not in laughter, but in low, stunned conversation. Eleanor Briggs sat near the wall, wrapped in blankets, her weathered face composed, but her eyes distant. Sarah Miller arrived with her son bundled against her chest, her dark hair loose now, her pale skin raw from cold and exhaustion. She looked at the wall as if it were alive. "You didn't build this for yourself," she said quietly, when Frank passed. He paused, considering the truth of it. "I built it because the world doesn't explain itself," he replied. "It just happens." Over the weeks that followed, the town rebuilt what it could. Not everything returned. Some laughter did, eventually, but it was different, thinner, cautious, earned. Frank did not accept thanks easily. He repaired his wall where it had been scarred, replaced planks warped by ice-filled tunnels with stone and frozen earth until they were nothing more than memories. When asked how he knew what to do, he answered simply, "I paid attention." That answer unsettled people more than any technical explanation. In spring, when the thaw revealed the true scale of what had happened, officials came. Surveyors, researchers, men and women in clean coats with notebooks and careful questions. They spoke of unusual weather patterns, of animal behavior under pressure of collective adaptation. Frank listened politely and showed them the wall, its circle, its uneven heights, its layered defenses. He did not charge for the knowledge. He never would. He remembered too clearly what it was like to be young and unprepared to learn lessons when the cost was already paid. He taught anyone who asked. He walked them along the perimeter, explaining why corners failed, why wind needed confusion, why time was the most valuable resource you could buy. He emphasized preparation without fear, respect without panic. Some listened, some nodded and forgot. Frank did not chase belief. He offered readiness. Years passed. The wall endured, repaired, and reinforced its principle unchanged even as materials improved. Children grew up knowing it as part of the landscape, a strange circular reminder that winter was not an enemy, but a test. Every year, when the first heavy snow fell and the wind began to speak in deeper voices, Frank Walker walked the wall at midnight, with Rex older, now slower, but still vigilant. They listened together, feeling the pressure of the world on wood and stone, noting how the air moved differently inside the circle. Frank would smile, then just slightly, not with pride, but with recognition. War had taught him it first. Winter had confirmed it. Survival did not belong to the strongest or the loudest. It belonged to those who noticed change early, who respected what they could not control, and who prepared not because they were afraid, but because they understood. In the end, Frank Walker's story leaves behind more than a wall of wood and iron. It leaves a quiet reminder of something older than storms and stronger than fear. Sometimes what we call a miracle does not arrive as thunder from heaven or light breaking through the clouds. Sometimes the miracle is a warning, placed gently in our path, a sound in the night, a feeling we cannot explain, a wisdom planted by God long before we know we will need it. Faith does not always mean waiting for rescue. Often faith means preparing with humility, trusting that God speaks through reason, experience, and the quiet instincts He places in our hearts. Frank did not build his wall out of panic. He built it with respect for nature, for life, and for the belief that God grants wisdom to those willing to listen. When the storm came, the miracle was not that danger disappeared, but that preparation, perseverance, and grace were already there to meet it. In our own lives, storms may not look like blizzards or wolves in the dark. They may come as illness, loss, loneliness, or moments when the future feels uncertain. Yet the lesson remains the same: listen carefully, act wisely, and trust that God walks with those who choose readiness over fear. Every small step you take today, every act of patience, kindness, and preparation can become tomorrow's miracle. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need encouragement today. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what storms you've overcome or are preparing for. And if you believe stories like this matter, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing messages of hope, resilience, and faith. May God bless you, protect you, and guide you through every season of life. May He grant you wisdom in calm days and courage in difficult ones. And may you always remember survival's strength and faith grow best in hearts that are prepared.